Greetings, AP Euro scholars, for our unit review for Unit 10 on Imperialism up through World War I. Looking at the review sheet from top to bottom, the importance of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is important in that it connected Great Britain with its Asian empire, the jewel in the crown, India, and Ceylon, Burma, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, among other places. And the Egypt was sort of a de facto protectorate at the turn of the century, not under direct British control, but in reality, the Brits who had bought out the Egyptian share in this canal, originally built by the French, called the shots. The Boer War. You know, the opponents here are the United Kingdom, the Brits, and the South African Boers. The Boers are descendants of these early Dutch colonists who, once Cape Town is taken over, the Boers move into the interior and they form these places called the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And in these two areas of Boer control in the interior, they discover gold and diamonds. And the Brits are various pretexts here for taking these places over, will basically initiate a war against the Boers, who will fight back for their independence. And it will start out a tough war for the British, but they will eventually, by dint of sheer numbers and weaponry, will defeat the Boers and incorporate their republics into a larger union of South Africa. The Opium Wars and Hong Kong. What you should know here is there are two opium wars, and the gist of it is the Brits are buying a lot of Chinese tea, and the Chinese they don't want to import anything, and the emperor doesn't want to import anything. He just wants gold and silver, and the Brits are looking for something they can essentially swap, and that is opium. And China will be forcibly, the war will be fought for the right to sell opium in China. It's a very profitable trade. Britain will win the war, will sell the opium, and will be granted use of various ports, and will be given a long-term lease on Hong Kong. And the Brits will take the right of what's called extraterritoriality, having their subjects tried in an English court and not in a Chinese one. You should be familiar, Macau is near Hong Kong. It is a trading port controlled by Portugal. Spheres of influence, also called concessions in China. These are zones of economic control along the coast of China, which by the early 1900s were controlled by, these are not colonies, but these are areas under the control of the Brits, of France, of Germany, of Japan, and Russia. And these countries forced on the Chinese exclusive trading rights and this principle of extraterritoriality. And this will lead in 1900 to what's called the Boxer Rebellion. And the official name of the Boxers is the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fighting Fists. And this was a group of Chinese nationalists who are reacting to foreign humiliation, foreign intervention, and they will attack foreign embassies in Peking, modern-day Beijing, and they will attack missionaries and kill Chinese Christians, and an international army of about 8 nations will invade China and successfully put this rebellion down. Rudyard Kipling and the White Man's Burden. This is a poem that very popularly describes the attitude of Great Britain and many colonists towards, in particular, Africa. This is a very pro-poem, and it tells about the duty of whites to protect, to teach, to civilize lesser races. And in this poem, the Africans here are called half-devils, half-child. And the idea here is that the Europeans have civilization, they have Christianity, they have these things to offer, and it's a duty to bring these. It's not just merely an excuse or a rationalization, supposedly, but this is a duty to help those who are benighted and behind in progress. Justifications for imperialism. Well said, civilization and Christianization, protection, and you have this argument that there's military necessity. You need bases. You need bases that are strategic, like Cape Town at the bottom of Africa, or control of the Suez Canal. You need ports to coal your ships, both merchant ships and military ships. And then you have this economic argument that you need markets to sell your goods and you need places to extract natural resources. And Lenin very famously says that imperialism is the natural outgrowth of capitalism itself, that capitalism is relentlessly expansionist and exploitive, and that this explains the movement of Europeans overseas for people to conquer and do business with. The German demand for a place in the sun, this is sort of a metaphor for this new nation that is created really after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. And the Germans, like the other Europeans, see the possession of colonies as conferring status. And they're sort of the Johnny-come-lately. And the Germans are going to be seen by the French and the British as upsetting the balance of power, especially in Africa. And the Kaiser is going to interfere twice, thus the term the First and Second Moroccan Crises, in an area that really is an area of French influence. The Kaiser is going to congratulate the Boer leader Paul Kruger on some early defeats of the British Army in the Boer War. And the German guns are going to be sold to the Boers. And the Germans are building this Berlin to Baghdad railway, which is getting down into an area where the Brits have, they have sway in Egypt, and they have concern for control of the canal so that they can get to their Pacific and Indian Ocean colonies. And the Germans are seeing that this upset of balance of power. The Germans are doing these things. In addition, the Germans are building up their navy. If you look at a map, there's not a lot of Germany that's touching the ocean. The Brits have this huge overseas empire. About 25% of the landmass of the earth at one time is under the British flag. So who are the Germans? What are they building up this navy for, especially if they don't have very many colonies? And you have this arms race at the turn of the century and the building of what are called dreadnoughts, sort of the state-of-the-art weapon at the time. And the Germans are being provocative. Differences between the new imperialism of the 18th and 19th centuries with the old imperialism. Think of the old imperialism as following 1492 in Columbus. You've got that period of the 1500s where the Spanish are dominant, and then the 1600s with the Dutch, and after that the Brits. Well, some similarities in the two imperialisms. There's this hunt for resources, think of mercantilism in the Americas, and this rivalry to show power and to possess military bases, and this ethnocentrism, this idea that the Europeans are spreading civilization and religion. This is in the new imperialism, but it's also there with that God, gold, and glory, where the conquistadores are in Latin America spreading the faith. Well, some differences. The new imperialism is going to involve the United States and Japan, who are not players hundreds of years earlier. The new imperialism is also going to include some European countries, which are not big players, say, in the Americas, Germany, Italy, and Belgium. The new imperialism will take over all of Africa. In 1885, you have the Berlin Conference, this meeting of the Europeans discussing the rules. What do you need to do to have a legal claim on your chunk of Africa? Now, asterisk here, there are two places that aren't taken over. That's Ethiopia, who successfully beat the Italians back, and Liberia, which is kind of an American tied to the United States in many ways. You have this imperial jingoism, which is a phrase for the super patriotism used to perhaps direct or redirect the attention of the lower classes who might be upset about social problems at home. You have the Chinese concessions, this divvying up of the coast and these spheres of influence, these what are called concessions, these areas of sovereignty where the control of investments lies in the hand of one European country and not the others. The Chinese emperor is basically without any significant power to stop them. You have the capturing of land for markets is more pronounced. Again, this Leninist idea that capitalism needs to spread. You have less permanent settlement, and you have less intermarriage with the new imperialism. And think about the Puritans and the Jamestown settlers in Virginia. Think about all the Spanish who are intermarrying with the Indians from Mexico down to Chile and Argentina. So you have this whole mestizo race, which is half European. You don't have this as much in the new imperialism, and you have less permanent long-term settlement. a lot more railway building in the new imperialism, and I would argue you have more cruelty. And the worst case is this Leopold II of Belgium, who is the king, and he's going to rule Congo as a personal fiefdom, and he is going to be responsible for the death of 10 million Congolese, and he's forcing them, the Congolese, to bring his minions ivory and rubber, and if not, you're dead or you get your hand chopped off, and this is barbaric. The alliances that lead to World War I, be familiar with the side the United States joins. These are the good guys. These are the allies, quote unquote, and that's the Triple Entente, the Brits, the French, and the Russians. The Triple Alliance, these are the bad guys from an American perspective. These are also called the Central Powers: Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And keep in mind, Italy will switch sides in the first year of the war. And these are the key European sides. I mean, there's other countries, don't worry about those. You might want to take note that the Ottomans do join the Germans and the Austrians, and they are going to block access to the Black Sea, most famously at the Battle of Gallipoli. Sarajevo, Bosnia, 1914. 1914 is one of those dates you got to know for AP Euro. And this is, Bosnia is under, if you look at a map, Bosnia is in between Serbia and the Adriatic. Bosnia is full of Serbians. The Austrians have taken it over earlier, and the Serbs are laying claim to it. And there's a group called the Black Hand. This is a nationalist terrorist group, which will, one of the members, Gavrilo Princip, is going to kill the Archduke Franz Ferdinand when he is on a goodwill tour of the provinces in Sarajevo, along with his wife Sophie. And this assassination of the heir to the throne of Austria is going to lead to Austria attacking Serbia. And this is the beginning of this ripple effect, these dominoes falling as alliances come into play, pulling countries into war. How various nations provoked each other. Think of, the Russians are seeing themselves as the protectors of the Serbs, who are Orthodox and Slavic. So when Austria attacks Serbia, this brings Russia into the fray. The Germans are going to back the Austrians. The Germans feel that they really only have one significant partner in Europe. The Russians have been humiliated in an earlier war, 1904-5. You have the loss to the Japanese, so that the Russians have a chip on their shoulder. And remember, France has lost Alsace-Lorraine, had to pay this huge reparations for losing the Franco-Prussian War. So these alliances are going to pull countries into combat with each other. And when the Germans invade Belgium, Belgium has an alliance, a treaty where the Brits promise that they will defend Belgium. So the treaties and the alliances do cause in very quick order these countries to fight each other and to honor the provisions or the conditions of the alliances. The German Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan is this idea that Germany's between France and Russia. What do you do if both sides are moving towards you? And the plan is to hit the French first. The thinking is the Russians can't get a significant force to the border because of sort of the primitive state of their army and the railroads. And the plan is, in the Schlieffen Plan, is to go through the side door, neutral Belgium, and to conquer France in a few weeks and then move your army to the East Prussian frontier and to block and turn back the Russians. And this is what happens. The Germans do invade Belgium, and they attack the northwest part of France. And some new World War I weapons. You've got machine guns, you've got heavy artillery, you've got tanks, you've got flamethrowers, you've got submarines, you've got planes, which are mostly used for aerial reconnaissance, and you have hand grenades. These are some of the weapons that make, especially the heavy artillery and the machine guns, make this war very lethal and turn it into a war of largely immobility and stasis, as you can't get very far because you get gunned down once you get out of the trenches. Women during World War I, the AP, goes without saying, is very politically correct, and there's always feminist questions. So remember everything you hear about women from Renaissance on. But women are going to be taking the jobs of men who go off to fight. They're going to be taking jobs in factories, jobs in business, jobs on farms. You have women who are going to become nurses in the various armies. You've got women who are going to be demanding, at least at war's end, the right to vote based upon these principles of equality. You have women who are going to be doing sort of charitable work in hospitals and in collecting, rolling bandages, making bandages, and knitting socks for soldiers, and dealing with war orphans and things which are women's roles in a wartime situation like that. You have, the Balfour Declaration. You should know that in 1917 there was a British public statement supporting the creation of a Jewish state in the former Ottoman Empire, and the Brits will fight the Ottomans. The Ottomans are, the most famous fight is that Battle of Gallipoli, where several 100,000 Brits are and Empire members, such as the Anzacs, the Austrians, and the New Zealanders, will die in this failed attempt to force the Dardanelles to open up between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The Balfour Declaration is this promise to create a Jewish state in what's called Ottoman Palestine. And one of the problems here is, if you ever watched Lawrence of Arabia, that Academy Award-winning movie with Peter O'Toole, Mr. Lawrence is a British officer who's going to successfully organize the Arabs, who are not Turks. The Arabs are going to uprise against the Turks because they're being promised they're going to have independence as well. Two competing claims to Palestine. The Easter Uprising of 1916, Irish nationalists take over the center of Dublin and in the middle of World War I, and they declare independence. And the British are going to crush this rebellion, and this is later going to lead to, after the war, fighting between those nationalist Irish who demand independence and not any sort of second-class status like the Canadians or the Australians or the New Zealanders, who have become dominions, technically loyal to the crown, but they sort of began this rebellion early in a very bad time from a British perspective. Why did Germany think they might win in 1917? Well, remember 1917, a number of things are happening. The Russian Revolution is going to, and keep in mind there is sort of this double revolution. In the spring of 1917, the Tsar abdicates because of the war. The war is going very badly. There's food riots, there's strikes, there's mutinies in the army, and he's going to abdicate, and the Kerensky government of the Duma will create a technically democratic government for about 6 months. They're great failures. They stay in the war, and then the Kerensky provisional government will be overthrown by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and that's really the revolution that most people remember. And what happens is Lenin will sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and that's going to surrender. The Russians will surrender a good chunk of the Russian Empire to the Germans. The Russians will quit the war, demobilize their army, and the Germans will move millions of soldiers from Russia, the Eastern Front, to the Western Front. And this Operation Michael, the Germans will slam into France. I mean, it's a massive attack. At the same time, the Germans here are going to begin unrestricted sinking of American ships who are sending all sorts of supplies, sort of keeping the Brits afloat here. And the thinking is you can stop American help before the Americans can send supplies and troops over. America does declare war. And basically the Germans gamble wrong. They gamble poorly. The Americans start showing up by the millions, increasing the morale of the Allied side and deflating the morale of the German side. And on the Western Front, none of the war is fought in Germany itself. Germany will surrender because they're demoralized, because there's food shortages, because of the British blockade. There's riots, there's strikes, there's mutiny, and the Germans think that they're going to get a good deal. Remember, you've got that 14 points, this peace plan from Wilson, President of the United States, and he's talking about a peace without victors, a peace without humiliation. And the Germans think that the Americans who have some clout here at the end of the war with their army and with their huge supply of weapons and food and how they're sort of bankrolling the Allied cause, that Wilson will act as a brake on French and British revenge. And that's why the Germans arguably will surrender. And the 1918 armistice is the ceasefire that precedes the actual treaty, which is the Versailles Treaty. And this armistice is at November 11th, the 11th month, 11th day at 11 a.m. And this will basically stop the war while there's these negotiations between the victors. The Germans aren't invited. First of all, they're the losers. They're going to take it or leave it, and nobody wants the Germans, playing anybody off. The Russians are not invited because they've gone communist. And remember, the Russians have signed this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which they surrender this huge area. They surrender much of Russia. The Germans get to be about 150 miles from Petrograd, which later becomes Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg. The Russians will control Ukraine and Poland, the Baltic states, and this falls under German control. The Versailles Treaty is considered to be very punitive, and just a note for those of you who are my students looking on the review sheet, the Versailles Treaty is actually signed in 1919. It says 1918 on here, small error, but just know the armistice is 1918. The Versailles Treaty signed in 1919. Things which will be problematic for a long-lasting peace. There's the war guilt clause. The Germans have to agree that they caused the war. That's called Clause 231. They have to dismantle their navy. At my count, there were 108 major ships that got sent off to England got turned over. And the Germans kind of sneakily will open up the shuttlecocks in the ships and sink them at Scapa Flow, where the Brits are sort of looking forward to getting their hands on some of these big weapons of war. So they have to turn over their navy. They have to end no air force. They have to turn over their heavy artillery. They're limited to a 100,000-man army from this multi-million-man army. They lose all of their colonies. The Germans have to pay reparations, something in the 30 billion range. And I'm filming this right now, 2019. Last I checked, the equivalent of the 30, 32, 33 billion, however you translate this in dollars at the time, comes out to something like 400, 500 billion dollars today. So it's a huge reparations. Now the French are arguing that the Germans have destroyed lots of mines, lots of factories, lots of coal fields, and they've done huge agricultural destruction. Much of it deliberately on the way out, what isn't already destroyed during the war. So this isn't just punishment, but this is sort of justice. Keep in mind, the Germans made the French pay the equivalent of 1 billion francs in gold before the Germans left in 1871. The Germans lose much of eastern Germany, becomes the new nation of Poland. You have a Polish corridor separating Germany. There's a part of Germany, East Prussia, will be physically cut off from the rest of Germany by a corridor allowing Poland access to the sea, including the port of Danzig, which is basically a German town turned over to the Poles to use. You have Czechoslovakia is created, and there's 3 million Germans in an area called the Sudetenland. And then the Rhineland is going to be demilitarized and temporarily occupied. And some of the coal mines there are going to be taken over in payment for coal mines that were destroyed by the departing German army. So there's some thoughts here on the age of imperialism through World War I and its end. So good luck, gang.